Hello and welcome to My Security TV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage and I'm the Executive Editor with My Security Media. And today we're going to be joined by Michael Daniel, the President and CEO with Cyber Threat Alliance. And this is on the back of a Ransomware Task Force. So we're going to be looking at the Cyber Threat Alliance sort of role in the industry and looking forward to having Michael join us back. We last spoke to Michael in 2017 when he was here in Sydney. And Michael, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Great. And there has been a lot of water under the bridge, I said earlier, since 2017. It was October 2017 to be specific. And it was our 7th episode of our Cybersecurity Weekly podcast. And we're just approaching 300 episodes. So very early on the piece. So it's great to have you back. And also, I imagine there's a lot being changed in terms of the Cyber Threat Alliance, in terms of your membership. Back then, it was Sophos and Saint Security, which were your new affiliate members back then. So I can imagine a lot has changed. So maybe over to you, the President and CEO of Cyber Threat Alliance. Maybe introduce us to the CTA, and then we'll cover off on the Ransomware Task Force.
Sure. So, in fact, a lot has changed since October of 2017. We're now up to 33 members from about 10 different countries, actually, in terms of where the companies are headquartered. I mean, obviously, most of them are global in terms of their scope and coverage. But, we've rebuilt our platform and dramatically expanded the way that we do our automated sharing. So we're, running at about 250,000 indicators a day through the platform now. We've built out a analytics sharing capability to really focus on the humans, the researchers and the analysts that participate in CTA. So we've got an early sharing program now where members will share pre-publication versions of blog posts and research papers to give other members a heads up, advance warning. So, and we've really begun to engage and, have a much broader online presence and engagement more broadly across the industry. So yeah, a lot has really changed. We've really grown and matured since then.
And it really is that sort of portal, sort of common industry portal that you've built for that threat intel. That's really the crux of it, is it not?
Sure. Yes. The automated sharing platform, we call it Magellan. But that platform is where all the members contribute intelligence to technical threat intelligence and pull that technical threat intelligence back into their companies to use in their products and services. And that's, and we really focus on those that are providing cybersecurity services to others. A lot of sharing organizations focus on particular industry verticals. We really focus on cybersecurity providers, the ones that are providing services to a bank or to a hospital or to an energy company or something like that.
Yeah, well, it's worth having a look at cyberthreatalliance.org. And most of are they all your members there, their logos on the main page? Because
they are. Yep.
Just remind me, how many members did you have?
Yeah, we got 33.
33. Is that selective in its own right, or you imagine that will just continue to grow? Because they do look like a bit of the who's who in the sector. Is there what's the process of getting involved and becoming a CTA affiliate partner?
Sure. The way that you become involved with CTA, we are open to anyone that can meet our sharing requirements. You have to be able to meet a few other requirements too, including being able to do business in the United States. Even if you aren't actually actively doing business in the US, you have to be able to can't be on a sanctions list and things like that, because we are a US-based nonprofit. But beyond that, we require all of our members to be able to contribute a certain amount of technical threat intelligence. So you've got to be able to put technical threat intelligence into a standard format. We use sticks. And you have to be able to put it into that format and share it with us on essentially a daily basis. Now we try to set that standard of sharing so that small companies, new startups can join. We do have some. You mentioned Saint Security. That's a fairly small South Korean company. We also have a relatively newcomer to the scene, Blue Live, out of Spain. So along with some of the older members like McAfee and Symantec and Checkpoint. We also have some newcomers as well, and so we try to structure our threshold so that we can enable those smaller members to still join, but you have to actually be a legitimate cybersecurity company. You can't just be a PowerPoint deck.
Got it. And you've got to be contribute. I take it you've got to contribute to the intel, otherwise you're just there taking, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so we don't want any, we don't want to deal with the free rider problem. So the way that we address that is we just don't let any free riders happen. So you've got to be contributing to the threat intelligence in order to be a member.
Well, maybe then, I like it, and most of those vendors we've obviously spoken to and work with. How does it work across the community now in terms of the CTA? What other role do you tend to have? And that's hopefully will lead us into the Ransomware Task Force. I take it once you've got that collective, you're a not-for-profit as well. What role are you taking across the industry as well?
So one of the key roles that we're really trying to take is developing this idea of operational sharing. So you've got automated sharing that happens at machine speed and using the technical data. You've got analytic sharing that happens at human speed that involves the human interpretation of that data. But what I want to do is build out that capability to then take that shared automated and analytic data and use it to help support operations against the bad guys. So whether you're talking about governments taking proactive operations to disrupt the bad guys, or defenders, making collective decisions about how to interrupt or reduce the efficacy of what the bad guys are doing, that's where I really want to take CTA. And we can help do that because we can be a point of leverage, right? That if you are communicating with CTA and involving us, like for example, in a disruption operation, you can reach a whole bunch of cybersecurity companies simultaneously without having to have a one-to-one relationship with each one of them, right?
Yeah.
And so we want to provide sort of an amplification, a force multiplier, if you will, in the industry. And we also want to serve as a locus of expertise, right? And so even if I don't, or my own staff doesn't know the answer, we've got this network of really impressive people at all of these different cybersecurity companies, and odds are some of them know the answer to your question, whatever it is. And so we can really serve as kind of that hub for moving information of all kinds.
And you also, it looks like you're working with the vendors on specific projects as well. I'm just looking at some of the assets here. We just did a session yesterday with security scorecard as an example,
Sure.
And I can see you've got that up here as well. Are you issuing sort of warnings and threat intel updates as well to say this has come out, or you still have to rely on those individual vendors that you work with or clients actually work with?
Yeah, so we don't really try to produce our own threat intelligence, right? That's what our members do. Where you see some of those assets up there, that's where we feel like we've been able to add something as a collective voice to those products to make them, again, serving in that force multiplier role to sort of amplify their impact and their effects. But really, our job is not to produce, our own threat intelligence products. Now, occasionally we do. So a good example is actually where we do some joint products is like the threat report on the cyber threats to the Tokyo Olympics.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was a joint effort among several of our members to provide a collective view of what we thought the cyber threats to those Olympics were going to be. And that is something we do occasionally put out, usually once or twice a year, we'll have one of those kinds of products to really provide that collective voice on an issue that's particularly important to a wide swath of the industry.
Nice. And that's a good segue to our ransomware task force. And obviously that is one of those particular trends that we've seen recently that has gained the headlines. From the RTF, the Ransomware Task Force, maybe talk us into that. You were on part of the sort of advisory working group co-chairs on that as well. Again, I think that sort of escalates where the CTA is at and held in esteem. what was the task force sort of, what's the background to the task force, who called it, and where some of the outcomes are going?
The task force itself really came out of a realization from a number of us that had, frankly, a lot of us that had served in government in previous roles, but were now out of government service, and really coming to grips with the fact that the nature of ransomware had fundamentally changed. If you roll the clock back, Chris, to like 2013, right? Ransomware is primarily an economic nuisance,
Yeah.
right? It's a low-level cyber crime that affects individual computers, maybe a small business. And I'm not saying it wasn't important to those small businesses or to those individuals. Don't get me wrong. The impact could be really, important to those institutions or those individuals. But the ransoms were small. They were usually a couple of $100, maybe $1,000. They weren't, and it wasn't sort of economically systemic. But by 2020, that picture has changed, right? Ransomware had become a national security threat. It had become a public health and safety threat, because now you're talking about huge enterprises being affected, hundreds of millions of dollars in ransoms being paid. And as we saw this past spring with the attack on Colonial Pipeline here, potential for massive disruption across the economy. And so in that situation, the Ransomware Task Force brought together about 60 experts from all sorts of different areas, including law enforcement and incident responders, under the auspices of the Institute for Security and Technology, headed by a former White House colleague of mine, Phil Reiner. And really the task force set out to say, okay, if you wanted to tackle the ransomware problem with some specific policy recommendations, what would we tell the government to do? Now, we wrote that document aimed at the US government because most of us had served in the US government, and we didn't really think that we knew enough about other governments to really tell people how to organize themselves. But we do think that many of the themes from that report are internationally applicable. And that we have, subsequent to issuing that report, we have tried to engage with governments around the world, particularly from our close friends and partners, places like Australia, to actually have those conversations and talk through those themes. And when you really look at what the task force laid out, it essentially said, you need to do a few things to really go after the ransomware problem. You essentially need to do a better job of deterring the criminals to begin with. You need to actually go after and disrupt those criminal networks in some fashion. You need to be able to prevent ransomware from happening in the first place. And given that those first three things are going to fail some of the time, you need to be able to respond more effectively to ransomware when you have those inevitable attacks. And that was essentially all of the recommendations that the task force made were focused on one of those, one or more of those four areas.
Well, before there's I want to go in various different ways. I suppose the task force was made up. Your background, you're under the Obama administration with the National Security Council, as I understand it. But you've also been in this role for a few years now, since we did last meet. But some of the others on the working chairs, we had John Davis, Palo Alto Networks, Kemba Walden, Microsoft, Chris Painter, many of us know in Australia. He's with the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation. He had Rapid7. So this was obviously from your vendor group, right? Am I reading this correctly? Yeah. And the Institute of Security and Technology, IST, is the one that kind of led this, I understand.
Yes. Now, and when you look at the people that were involved, yes, many of them had prior government experience, like General Davis, John Davis, former Army, and very involved with cyber issues. Megan Stiefel with the Justice Department, Chris Painter, you mentioned. So it was a very broad swath.
Now, when you mentioned those sort of four key sort of themes, I suppose, in terms of the strategy in response and deterrence, have you seen any outcomes from that, and how far and wide that report might have gone? And then we'll talk about Australia's ransomware plan as well and how that might align. You've had a look at that Australian plan. But yeah, the report, how it was received, and any implications from that type of report.
I think our report was actually, I'll say, unfortunately, timely, in the sense that it arrived. I guess what I would say, Chris, is we were right,
Yeah.
in the sense that ransomware is a big problem, right? And that governments were looking for ways to combat it more effectively. So I feel like we were able to help shape the thinking of the U.S. National Security Council and many people within DHS and the State Department and elsewhere within the U.S. government, and also some allied governments as well, to really begin to think about how to tackle this problem more effectively. And so you've seen the U.S. start making moves to turn up the pressure, for example, on some of these criminal groups. You've seen the U.S. move to say, look, we need to actually look at how the cryptocurrency markets function. And are there some rules that we need to put in place to make those less usable by bad guys? You can see the efforts to assemble that 30-nation coalition that the U.S. Recently sponsored that meeting of, to try to focus attention on the international aspects of fighting ransomware. So I really do think the report has had some impact across the board in how people have thought about and are trying to really tackle the ransomware problem.
What's the situation, before we come to Australia, the legislative situation in Australia? Is there consideration to make payment of ransom illicit, where you have to report it?
So there's certainly, in the United States, there is definitely legislation that would impose actually a broad cybersecurity incident reporting requirement. And there would definitely be, and as part of that, while that reporting requirement would not apply to, it would only apply to a subset of companies that are either of a certain size or performing critical national function. But there would also be a reporting requirement that would say, yes, if you're gonna make a ransomware payment, you have to report that. And I think that's actually really important, because part of the reason that the task force supported such an idea was to say, look, one of the things we actually want to know more about as a government is how many companies are actually paying ransoms right now, and how much are they paying? We don't actually know the answer to that question, and it makes it harder to implement good policy if you don't have good data like that. But the other aspect of that is maybe it will make a few companies think twice. If they know that they've got to be on record reporting that they are making a payment, that maybe it'll make them think twice about doing that, and make it really think about whether or not that's the right move for them economically, and for the long term, that paying that ransom is the option that they want to pursue. And I think that's a good check to have in place.
Yep. Was there any thinking around when circumstances might be that ransomware is permissible or could be paid? Particularly, there was a hypothetical ran here as part of our Australia Cyber Week, and Chris Painter was on that panel, I think, if I get his position right. But it was one of those things. It was still up in the air. It was an attack on a hospital. Lives were at stake, and sort of the payment was a reasonable amount. Is that still, do you find in discussions that sometimes people are unsure whether a ransom would be paid? And fair enough if you have to report it, but when it's time critical, what's your general thoughts on that? Or is that just just don't ever pay the ransom, it's off the table?
So I would never. So my own personal view is that eventually government should make ransom payments illegal.
Yep.
But there's a lot of work to do before we get to that. Anybody who thinks that that's like the Staples easy button, I don't know if they run that ad campaign in Australia, but if anybody who thinks that it's like the easy button to just solve the problem, that is totally not the correct answer. I think that there's a lot of predicate that needs to be laid in terms of support. That if we're going to make that kind of policy and have it be effective, the government needs to be able to support institutions like that hypothetical hospital in a way that don't put those lives in the firing line, right? And then there's got to be some other options available, realistic options to paying that ransom. And right now, we're not in that position where you could actually make that as a credible case. And so in my view, it's premature to implement ransomware payment bans right now, or ransom payment bans right now. But that's a goal that we should be working towards. And we need to put those policies in place to make that a realistic, viable policy.
And again, it's one of those collectives you would need internationally as well. But that does take us to the Australian ransomware plan, and certainly the reporting of ransomware attacks and the like is on the cards now. What's your initial thoughts on the ransomware plan, and have you seen other countries coming out with similar plans, or how sort of leading did you find that plan?
I thought it was a very good initial plan to deal with ransomware. Like, it is a really solid set of activities. Everything that is in that plan are good steps to take that will get you if they were really fully implemented as it was laid out in that plan, Australia would make, I think, some real progress against the ransomware threat. That it's really got. I mean, if you listen to what I was talking about, the elements of what our 4 elements, you can see that in the plan. The same sort of themes are running through that plan about, how do you actually make the economy more resilient? How do you actually make it a tougher, Australian companies and other organizations, tougher targets to hit? How do we actually disrupt what the bad guys are doing? How do we respond to, incidents more effectively? Those same themes are coming through in that ransomware plan, and it's backed up by some money. That much is also clear to me in there, and that's really important. That this is not just, if you will, it's not just a plan for a plan. There's actual money that is going behind some of those initiatives, and that's really important.
I think the key aspect that we did run a panel on it was it's a good sort of high level. This is a government position that we're taking, and I think you nailed it then when you said it's how will it be implemented, and then the impact it actually has down the track, and whether it needs to be tweaked. But this is all not necessarily new for everybody, but I think in that response, I recalled it was very similar to, say, the piracy issues that we were dealing around in 2010 in the Gulf of Aden, with the pirates coming out and seizing shipping containers and the like. And it got to a point where, okay, it's having such an impact, we ended up sending the navies in and dealing with it. Do you think that this is where it's gone, this point? Because I've just raised in my latest editorial for Cyber Leaders Mag, and it is actually, the title or the cover is "No Silver Bullet." So I like the way there's no green button that we can click. But there's some under the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Cybersecurity, CISA's binding operational directive 2022 and 01 in terms of significant risk of known exploited vulnerabilities for federal government agencies alone. There's some 18,000 vulnerabilities identified in 2020, and they've got to go through and remediate them all. So it's that we come back to the deterrence, I suppose. Maybe that's where I'm going. The threat landscape is so open and expanding at such an exponential rate with IoT and the like. It's one of those things of deterrence is going to be very, very difficult, is it not? These gangs can come up and disappear, reform, and then come again. It's almost that corporate cyber war that we're potentially moving into. Is that something you can reasonably foresee?
One of the things that is very true about cyberspace, right, is that the cost of entry, the barrier to entry for malicious cyber activity is low, and it's gotten lower, right? The adversaries have now figured out how to offer ransomware as a service, right? You don't even really have to be a coder or a hacker now to run a ransomware or even any sort of cyber criminal campaign. And so certainly conducting deterrence against that kind of activity is going to be very challenging. That said, I don't think we should give up, hope of trying to increase the level of deterrence that is out there. There are a number of nations that provide safe haven to a lot of these criminal groups, and we need to turn up the diplomatic pressure on them. They need to pay a price diplomatically for providing that safe haven so that we can start to change that equation and maybe have them not provide nearly as much safe haven. Now, nobody thinks that we're going to be able to get rid of cyber crime from the internet any more than we've gotten rid of, street crime in, the cities, right? Or white collar crime. Like that is a part of the world. But we have got to get it down to a level that we can manage, like over the long term. And so, like your piracy example is a good one of, you have something that had just gotten out of hand, had gotten too big, too large to ignore and becomes a national security threat. And in that case, you have to bring different assets, broader assets beyond just law enforcement in to deal with the issue. And I think that's where we are with ransomware.
Very good. What about those key alliances? And this is becoming still a nation state issue as well. I think, does that sort of compound where ransomware is, where nation states are potentially, the word's not coming to me, but proxy attacks and the like, where cybercrime does get to that level where it's a national security threat because there is an adversary nation state behind it. That just compounds this at an extra level. Would that be right?
Yes. And when you look at, to put a direct point on it, right, the fact that Russia has found it in its interest, that it sees it as being in its interest to provide safe haven and to support these kinds of criminal activities is a problem. And, I think that there needs to be a lot of discussion about how we actually work to change that calculus. And so that the Russian view of their interests changes over time, and that they don't find it as useful to have those kinds of proxies doing their bidding in this area. But make no mistake about it. A lot of these criminals are also very opportunistic, right? They also operate out of countries that have weak rule of law, or have security services that are willing to just look the other way. And so we also need to be engaged more broadly across all the different parts of the world to raise that level of capability on the part of all governments to actually manage the malicious activity that could be emanating from their territory.
Well, look, I'm an optimistic pessimist, so I always think that things will optimistically continue to be problematic. But Michael, I suppose we could go much further, but I just wanted to highlight that's where the scourge of ransomware really is, that it's not just opportunistic criminals, but it is also nation states, and a national ransomware attack coordinated by a nation state, you could do a lot of damage if it was coordinated at a high and sophisticated level. And I think that was the wake-up call out of Colonial Pipeline and the like of what we've actually been seeing. And again, you mentioned Russia there as well. So I think that is where those Western nations, from a public perspective, need to understand that this is a serious issue. And obviously, it's good to see governments making some steps forward, I suppose, is one of a better word. Expectations for 2022, if I kind of outline that's how bad it can get, what is your expectations for 2022? And I suppose even from the CTA's perspective, what are some of the key milestones for next year that you have, significant events or sort of reporting that you have planned?
I think there was a good colleague of mine once said that it's very easy to be a cybersecurity expert. And somebody said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Sure, all you got to do is say it's going to be worse tomorrow than it is today, and you're probably going to be right. So that makes you a cybersecurity expert." And unfortunately, I think that we're going to continue to see that the trends that we've been talking about over the course of this podcast are going to continue into 2022. And if anything, they're going to intensify, right? As we continue to build out and build out that Internet of Things, and it really just becomes what we call the Internet, right? That it's nothing particularly special about it, that it just is the way that it is. But I do think that there's some interesting aspects that go beyond those negative trends, which is that you are starting to see governments really think about how they actually disrupt criminal activity beyond just focusing on arrest and prosecution. Yes, it's great when we can put the handcuffs on the bad guys and prosecute them, but we're not always going to be able to do that. And so opening that aperture to say, okay, what are the other ways that we can impose costs on those adversaries, including disrupting the money flows, right? Looking at technical disruption to their infrastructure to force them to rebuild it over and over and over again, and invest money in doing that instead of, you know, attacking new targets. You can see the outlines of collaboration that, you know, are going to increase, I think, over 2022. From CTA's perspective, we're going to continue on our path to add more members, to continue expanding the kind of threat intelligence sharing that we're doing. We're always going to be continuing to refine our platform and the kind of data that we share. But we've also got some interesting projects in the works that I think are going to help illuminate the you know, the ability, or they're going to help illuminate some of that cybercrime ecosystem and make it more understandable to a broader audience, which will help with targeting and prioritization. I think you're also going to see, you're going to start to see some better tools coming out that are going to help the network defenders. I will also say that one other thing I think is going to start happening in the cybersecurity industry, because you're going to start seeing more pressure from end users for the cybersecurity vendors to actually make their stuff work together better. I think a lot of CISOs have reached the point where it's like, wait a minute, why am I the system integrator for all this stuff? Nice. You know, you guys go make this work together if you want me to buy your stuff. And so I think you're going to see additional pressure from the consumption end, for the enterprise end, to actually start having more of these cybersecurity tools work together more seamlessly in the background, because the bad guys really exploit those gaps and seams between our various cybersecurity tools.
I think that's a potential new vulnerability. I've definitely seen that this year. The last couple of years, obviously, it's been a massive change in the market, but a lot more partnerships, acquisitions, and some mergers as well along the way. It's that integration may add more complexity. Again, my optimistic pessimism was like, well, supply chain attacks come into play in that regard as well. But like I said, we're in the right game as far as I'm concerned. There's always something interesting and new trends coming through, and as well as the longer term trends that we continue to see. So hence why it's always nice to catch up with someone like Michael Daniel, President and CEO with Cyber Threat Alliance, and also have a bit of, we'll put a link into our 2017 podcast as well. And how long has the CTA been going for? Because I think you were relatively new in the role there, or recently? Back in
2017. Yeah, in 2017, I'd been in the role about only 6 months at that point. So
there you go.
We're actually, we're coming up on our 5th birthday at the end of January 2022. So
beautiful, a nice way to finish off as well. So happy 5th birthday to the CTA, and we'll stay in touch, Michael. Look forward to seeing you. Where in the US are you? So
in the Washington DC area.
Great. Well, hopefully we can catch up, maybe at an RSA or something similar for next year. And best of success for 2022.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for having me on today.
Pleasure. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.